The sky over South Texas in late October carried that particular shade of blue that only appears after the first cold front of the season pushes through. A deep, almost electric cobalt that stretches from horizon to horizon without a single cloud to interrupt it. The air was dry and sharp, carrying the faint smell of cedar and caliche dust. And the highway that cut through Frio County ran as straight and unforgiving as a fence line, flanked on both sides by mesquite trees that had been bent westward for so many decades by the prevailing wind that they seemed to be perpetually leaning away from something they didn't want to face. George Strait had been driving for nearly 3 hours. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Not his manager, not his publicist, not even Norma, who was visiting their daughter-in-law in San Antonio for the weekend. He had simply gotten into his old F-250. Not the newer one, the old one. The 2009 with the dent on the rear quarter panel and the cracked leather on the passenger seat that he'd never bothered to get fixed. And driven south out of San Antonio on Highway 35, past Pleasanton, past Jourdanton, until the towns got smaller and the spaces between them got longer, and the radio signal for every station except one faint AM frequency started to break apart into static. He wasn't running from anything. That much he knew. He was simply tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. The kind of tired that comes after decades of performing, of shaking hands, of smiling for cameras, of being George Strait the legend rather than George Strait the man. The Vegas residency had ended its latest run 2 weeks ago, and the silence that followed should have felt like rest. Instead, it felt like a hollow thing, an empty house where the furniture had been removed. He turned the radio all the way down and drove. The town of Driscoll Creek wasn't on most maps. It didn't have its own exit on the highway. You had to know to turn off at the county road marked with a rusting green sign that said CR 417, and then drive another 4 miles west on a road that transitioned from asphalt to packed caliche gravel about halfway through. The town itself consisted of a water tower, a post office the size of a one-car garage, a feed store called Pemberton's that had been in the same family since 1948, a Baptist church with a marquee sign out front that read, "God's grace is like rain. It falls on everyone." A diner called The Roundup that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon, and a scattering of houses ranging from freshly painted to barely standing, spread out along 3 streets that didn't have official names, only the ones locals had given them over generations. George had been born not far from here. Pearsall was only 30 miles to the northwest, and the geography of Frio County was coded into his body in a way that went deeper than memory, the smell of the land, the particular quality of the afternoon light, the way sound traveled differently here than anywhere else in the world, carried and absorbed by the flatness of the terrain in a way that made distant things feel oddly close. He pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Roundup at 20 minutes past noon. He was wearing what he always wore when he wasn't performing and wasn't being photographed: faded Wranglers, worn brown boots, a plain blue chambray shirt, and his everyday hat. Not the presentation hat, not the one he wore on stage, but the one with the sweat-stained band and the small crack along the left side of the brim where it had gotten caught in a truck door about 5 years ago. He looked like every other rancher in a 50-mile radius. That was the point. The diner had 6 tables, a counter with 8 stools, and a hand-painted menu board above the kitchen window. A ceiling fan moved the warm air around without doing much to cool it. There were 4 other customers, 2 older men at the counter drinking coffee and talking about cattle prices without much enthusiasm, a young woman in scrubs eating a plate of eggs with her eyes fixed on her phone, and a man at the corner table who was staring at a stack of papers the way a person stares at something they don't want to read but can't stop reading. George took a stool at the far end of the counter. A woman in her mid-50s appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel tucked into her apron. She had silver-streaked hair pulled back in a bun, dark eyes that assessed him with friendly efficiency, and the kind of face that suggested she had heard every story worth hearing, and a good number that weren't. "Just coffee to start, or you want to hear the specials?" she asked. "Coffee, please," George said. "And whatever the brisket plate comes with." "Pinto beans, potato salad, and a piece of cornbread," she said. "You want jalapenos on the side?" "Yes, ma'am." She poured his coffee without being asked again and moved back toward the kitchen. George wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth work its way into his palms. He wasn't looking at the man in the corner on purpose. But the diner was small, and the silence between the two older men at the counter had the kind of comfortable permanence that made other sounds stand out. And what George could hear from the corner table was the faint, involuntary sound of a man trying very hard not to show that he was struggling. The papers in front of him were from a bank. George couldn't read them from where he sat, but he recognized the format: the letterhead, the columns of numbers, the dense paragraphs of legal language that meant someone was in a very specific kind of trouble. He'd seen enough of those letters in his early years, back when the band was playing honky-tonks for gas money and the ranch was running on thin margins, to recognize the texture of financial crisis even at a distance. The man was somewhere around 60, lean in the way that comes from outdoor work rather than exercise, with hands that were large and rough and slightly too still, resting flat on either side of the papers as though he was afraid they might move. His face was weathered and angular, with deep-set eyes the color of creek water, and a jaw that was set hard against whatever the documents were telling him. He was wearing a work shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and on his left wrist there was a faded tan line where a watch had been. But no watch now. The woman with silver hair came out of the kitchen with George's plate, set it down in front of him, and then called toward the corner table in a tone that was gentle but deliberate. "Dale, you need anything else, honey?" The man, Dale, looked up. His expression shifted briefly, the way a person's face shifts when they realize they've been seen doing something they hoped was private. "I'm fine, Linda," he said. His voice was low and flat. "Thank you." She lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, looking at him the way a person looks at someone they've known long enough to read. Then she turned and went back to the kitchen. George ate his brisket and thought about nothing in particular for a while. He was finishing his second cup of coffee when Dale Hoffman began gathering his papers. His movements were slow and deliberate, with the mechanical quality of a man operating on some internal reserve of discipline, because the alternative was to fall apart in a diner in front of people he'd known his whole life. He squared the edges of the documents against the table, folded them with precise care, and slid them into a manila envelope that had already been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had gone soft. He stood. He was taller than he'd looked sitting down, 6'1" maybe, with the slightly forward lean of a man who had spent most of his life working in the bed of a truck or over an engine block. He left exact change on the table, counted from a worn leather billfold that he tucked back into his shirt pocket. He was almost to the door when his boot caught the edge of the threshold, and he stumbled, not falling, just a single graceless half-step that he caught himself from immediately. But it was the kind of thing that happens to a person when exhaustion has eaten into their coordination, when the body's reserve of basic physical competence has been quietly depleted by weeks or months of not sleeping enough. He caught the door frame, steadied himself, and went out without looking back. George watched him go. He left a 20 on the counter for an $8 meal, put on his hat, and followed. The parking lot of the Roundup had 5 vehicles in it. 4 were trucks. The 5th was an older Chevy Suburban with a cracked rear bumper and a bumper sticker for the Frio County 4-H program that had been on there long enough to fade from red to a washed-out pink. Dale Hoffman was standing beside it with his hand on the door handle and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, not moving. George stopped a few feet away. He didn't say anything immediately. He pulled his hat down slightly against the noon glare and looked out at the same patch of empty highway that Dale was staring at. After a moment, Dale said, without turning, "Something I can help you with?" "Not really," George said. "Just getting some air." A beat of silence. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire somewhere in the mesquite along the road's edge. "You're not from here," Dale said. It wasn't a question. "I grew up in Pearsall," George said. "Long time ago." Dale turned and looked at him, then a slow, assessing look that took in the hat, the boots, the chambray shirt, the general bearing of a man who was used to large spaces. His expression didn't change. If he recognized George, he gave no sign of it. "You passing through?" Dale asked. "Sort of," George said. "You?" Dale looked back at the highway. "I live here," he said. Then, after a moment, "What's left of here, anyway?" George nodded. He looked down at his boots and then back up at the sky. "You own the Hoffman place?" he asked. He'd seen the name on a mailbox on the county road coming in. A standard rural mailbox on a wooden post. Painted black once, and now mostly gray, with Hoffman stenciled on the side in white letters that were beginning to flake. Dale went very still. "Why?" "I saw the name on the way in," George said. "Just making conversation." A long pause. The mockingbird switched to a different phrase. "My grandfather built that house," Dale said finally. 1947. He came back from the war and built it with lumber. He milled himself from post oak. He cleared off the south pasture. He paused. 4 generations of my family were born there." George waited. "Bank's got a foreclosure notice on it," Dale said. His voice didn't break. It went, if anything, flatter. The way a person's voice goes flat when they've decided that saying a thing out loud is the only way left to deal with it. Process started in August. "I've got until the 15th of November to either come up with the delinquent amount or vacate." "How much?" Dale looked at him. "That's a personal question from a stranger." "It is," George agreed. "You don't have to answer it." Another silence. A pickup drove past on the county road. Slow. The driver lifting 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the minimal Texas wave. Dale raised his own hand in automatic response, then let it drop. $64,000, Dale said. Arrears plus penalties plus legal fees. He said it the way a person says a number that has been living in their chest like a stone for so long that they've almost gotten used to the weight. 3 years of bad cattle prices and 2 years of drought. Had to take out a second loan to keep the herd alive during the worst of it. Lost 30% of the herd anyway. And then my wife got sick. He stopped. She passed 14 months ago. "I'm sorry," George said, and he meant it in the specific way that he had learned to mean condolences over the course of a lifetime that had included its own share of grief. His daughter Jennifer's death in 1986 had never fully healed, had only scar tissued over into something he carried rather than something he'd recovered from. He knew what it meant to lose someone, and then have to keep standing upright in the world after. Dale nodded once, tightly. "My daughter lives with me. She's 28. Works at the school in Pearsall. She's a teacher. She doesn't know how bad it is." He paused. "I haven't told her." George looked at the man beside him, at the hands still too still on the door handle, at the jaw still set hard, at the eyes that were fixed forward with the discipline of someone who has made a private decision not to let himself come apart in a public parking lot on a Tuesday in October. "You have a lawyer?" George asked. "Can't afford one." You apply for any of the USDA emergency programs? There are drought assistance provisions, livestock forage disaster program, emergency loan modifications through the Farm Service Agency. Dale turned and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and something harder to name. You work for the government? No, George said. I grew up on a ranch. My father dealt with some of this. I've got some passing familiarity. I went to the FSA office in Pearsall 2 years ago, Dale said. They gave me paperwork. I filled it out, never heard back. Went back again 6 months later. Different person at the desk. Said there was no record of my application. A muscle in his jaw tightened. I don't have money for an attorney to fight bureaucracy. George was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the road again. Then he said, Can I come see the place? Dale stared at him. Why? I'd like to, George said. If that's all right. It was the kind of request that didn't make logical sense from a stranger. And they both knew it. Dale looked at him for a long moment with those creekwater eyes, measuring something that wasn't immediately nameable. Not threat, not suspicion exactly, but the particular human calibration of whether a person who is offering something unexpected is doing so from a genuine place or from an angle you haven't spotted yet. All right, Dale said finally. Follow me out. The Hoffman property was 840 acres of South Texas rangeland, and it was beautiful in the particular way that land in that part of the state is beautiful. Not the dramatic beauty of the hill country or Big Bend, but a quieter, harder beauty that requires knowing how to look for it. The native grasses had gone gold and rust with the season. The live oaks along the dry creek bed were the dense, rounded shapes that suggested great age. The house was a single-story limestone structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front, shaded by 2 enormous pecan trees that must have been there since before the house itself. The barn was weathered but structurally sound. The cattle pens were in good repair, but the pastures were thin. The stock tank in the north section was down to a fraction of its capacity, leaving a ring of dried, cracked mud around a shrinking body of water that was the color of weak tea. The south pasture had patches of bare caliche where grass had given up entirely. And the small herd of Hereford cattle, maybe 60 head, moved listlessly in the east pasture, their ribs slightly more visible than they should have been. A woman was at the barn when they arrived. She was slender and dark-haired, maybe 5'4", wearing jeans and work gloves and carrying a length of irrigation pipe that was almost comically too large for her frame. When Dale's Suburban pulled into the yard followed by an F-250 she didn't recognize, she set the pipe down and pulled off one glove and watched them park. "That's Cassie," Dale said through the truck window before he got out. "My daughter." Cassie Hoffman looked at the unfamiliar truck with the expression of a person who is perpetually on guard because perpetual vigilance has recently been proved necessary. She was pretty in an uncomplicated way, with her father's angular jaw and eyes that were dark brown rather than creek water gray. She had dried mud on her left boot up to the ankle and a smudge of grease on her right forearm. And she was looking at George Strait with polite, cautious curiosity that made it clear she did not recognize him. "This is—" Dale stopped. He looked at George. "I don't know your name." "George," he said. "This is George," Dale said. "He grew up in Pearsall. Came to look at the place." Cassie looked at her father with an expression that communicated, quickly and silently, a full paragraph of meaning. "Why did you bring a stranger here? Are you all right? What's going on?" And then she looked back at George and said, "Welcome. You want some water?" "Thank you," George said. "I would." He spent 4 hours at the Hoffman property that afternoon. He walked the pastures with Dale, asking the kinds of questions that come from a lifetime of familiarity with ranch land. About the water table, the grass species, the grazing rotation, the condition of the fencing. He looked at the hay stores in the barn, which were dangerously low. He looked at the stock tank and did a rough calculation of how long the water would hold at the current rate of use. He sat at the kitchen table with Dale and looked at the loan documents. The original note, the modification agreement from 2 years ago, the delinquency notice, the foreclosure filing, and read them with the careful attention of someone who was not a lawyer but had enough experience with contracts to understand the structure of what he was looking at. The situation was serious but not irretrievable. The FSA emergency loan modification pathway was still technically available. The deadline for that program hadn't passed. The foreclosure was in the early enough stage that a properly filed response, combined with an FSA intervention letter, could delay proceedings for 90 days minimum. That 90 days, with proper legal representation and a structured payment proposal, could potentially convert into a full loan restructuring. The sticking point was the legal representation. Without an attorney willing to work on a contingency or reduced fee basis, the paperwork would be filed incorrectly or not at all, and the bank's timeline would proceed uncontested. George sat with this information and turned it over carefully while Dale made coffee on an old electric percolator that looked like it had been manufactured in roughly 1985. Cassie came in from outside while the coffee was brewing. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink with her back to the room, and George could see from the set of her shoulders that she was listening to the silence between the two men at the table, with a precision that suggested she had been listening to the silences in this house for a long time. She turned around, drying her hands. She looked at her father. Then she looked at George, and this time her gaze was different, not unfriendly, but penetrating. "You're not just someone from Pearsall," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "No," George admitted. A pause. Dale looked up from the documents. "Who are you?" Cassie asked. George took off his hat and set it on the table. He looked at her steadily. "My name is George Strait," he said. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Dale stared at him. Cassie stared at him. The percolator made its small, domestic, gurgling sound. "The singer," Cassie said finally. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. Dale leaned back in his chair slowly, the old wood creaking, and looked at George with an expression that was hard to read. Something between stunned and quietly devastated. The particular vulnerability of a man who has accepted help from a stranger under the assumption of relative anonymity and now finds that anonymity removed. "I didn't know," Dale said. "I know you didn't," George said. "That's why I didn't say." "Are you—" Dale stopped. "Started again. Is this some kind of—" "No," George said quietly. "It's not a television thing. It's not a story. I came through here because I used to come through here as a kid, and I stopped for lunch, and I saw a man at a corner table reading foreclosure papers, and I know what that looks like." He paused. "That's all it is." Dale looked at him for a long time. Then he looked down at his hands, flat on the table beside the documents, and something shifted in his face. The long-held discipline of it, the careful, controlled flatness. And for just a moment, underneath it, George could see the full weight of what the man had been carrying. The grief, the exhaustion, the fear, the pride that had kept him from telling his daughter how bad things had gotten, the accumulated loneliness of handling a catastrophe in silence. Then Dale Hoffman pulled it back, took a breath, set his jaw again. "I don't need charity," he said. His voice was level. "I'm not offering charity," George said. "I'm offering to make some phone calls. You need a lawyer who knows farm debt law, and I know some people." He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. That's all I'm saying right now." Cassie was watching her father. Her eyes were bright in a way that she was working to control. "Okay," Dale said finally. "All right." George put his hat back on. "Good," he said. "You have a pen?" The morning after George Strait sat at the Hoffman's kitchen table, he drove back to San Antonio and made 3 phone calls before 8 o'clock. The first was to a man named Robert Finley, a San Antonio attorney who had spent 20 years specializing in agricultural law and farm debt mediation before semi-retiring to teach at St. Mary's University School of Law. George had met Robert at a charity event for the Texas Farm Bureau 8 years ago, and they had stayed in loose contact the way people do when there is genuine mutual respect without the structure of regular interaction. Robert was 63, methodical, and deeply familiar with the specific bureaucratic labyrinth of FSA loan modification procedures. George explained the situation in plain terms: the delinquent amount, the timeline, the failed application 2 years ago, the current foreclosure stage. "That failed application is actually useful," Robert said, over the sound of early morning traffic in the background. He walked to work, rain or shine, had done so for 30 years. If they lost it, there's a procedural argument for tolling the timeline. Potentially rolls back the whole calculus. "Can you take it on?" George asked. A pause. "Is the client going to be receptive?" "Some of these old ranchers." "He's proud," George said. "But he's not stupid. He knows what he's facing." "Send me what you have," Robert said. "I'll look at it this afternoon." The second call was to a man named Tom Abernethy, who ran an agricultural consulting firm out of Uvalde and had deep connections with the USDA's regional farm service infrastructure. Tom was 57. Blunt in the manner of a man who had spent 3 decades translating bureaucratic dysfunction into plain English for farmers who couldn't afford to misunderstand anything, and he knew every procedural shortcut and legitimate workaround in the FSA system for Frio County specifically. $64,000 in arrears, Tom said, after George outlined the situation. With a clean application and Finley pushing on the procedural angle, you're probably looking at a 60 to 90-day stay and a modification proposal. Whether the bank accepts the modification depends on the note terms. A pause. Who holds the note? George had written it down from the documents. First Southwest Agricultural Lending, Corpus Christi branch. "I know that branch," Tom said, in a tone that conveyed a complicated history. "They're not monsters, but they've got a production quota for the year, and they're not inclined to voluntary accommodation. You'll need the FSA letter and the legal filing in hand before approaching them. Otherwise, they stall and run out the clock. How fast can you move? If Finley's involved, we can coordinate. Give me the property parcel number." The third call was harder. George sat with his phone in his hand for a few minutes before making it, looking out the window of his truck at the San Antonio skyline in the morning light. Then he called Pastor James Wicker of the First Baptist Church of Driscoll Creek, whose number he had gotten from Linda Pruitt, the woman from the Roundup whose last name he'd asked before he left, who had given it to him without asking why, in the way that small-town people give information to people they instinctively trust. Pastor Wicker was 71, had been at that church for 34 years, and knew every family in Driscoll Creek and most of the families in a 20-mile radius, with the comprehensive intimacy of a man whose vocation required him to be present at every significant moment of their lives. He answered on the second ring in a voice that was warm and unhurried. George explained who he was and why he was calling in straightforward terms. There was a silence on the other end that lasted about 4 seconds. The silence of a man processing unexpected information and deciding how to receive it. Dale Hoffman hasn't said a word to anyone about the severity of it. Pastor Wicker said finally, "I knew things were hard. I didn't know they were that hard." "He's a proud man," George said. "He is," the pastor said. "His grandfather was the same way. They all were." A pause. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet," George said. "I just wanted someone in the community to know, in case it becomes relevant." He paused. "And I wanted to ask, is there anything else going on there? Anything I should know about before I get more involved?" Pastor Wicker was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality. Not heavier, but more careful. The way a man's voice gets when he's deciding how much of a complex truth to share with someone he's just met. "The town is struggling in the way that a lot of these small towns are struggling," he said. "It's not just Dale. 3 other families have sold out in the last 4 years. Young people leave for San Antonio or Laredo and mostly don't come back. The school in town closed. Kids bus to Pearsall now, which is why Cassie has to drive 40 minutes each way every day." He paused. "When a community loses its agriculture, it loses everything. The Hoffman place is the last working cattle operation with any real size left in Driscoll Creek. If it goes, there's nothing here." Another pause, and then, very quietly, "I've been praying about it for a long time." "Keep praying," George said. "But let me see what else I can do." George drove back to Driscoll Creek on Thursday. He didn't call ahead. He pulled into the Hoffman yard at 9 in the morning to find Cassie loading feed into the back of the Suburban, a task she was clearly performing before driving to school. She stopped when she saw the F-250, and something moved across her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the careful recalibration of expectations. "He's out in the east pasture," she said, before George could speak. She looked at him steadily. "He didn't think you'd come back." "I told him I'd make some calls," George said. "He figured you meant it as a polite thing to say." She lifted another bag of feed. "People say things. I meant it as a factual statement of intent," George said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was measuring and direct and not entirely unfriendly. "Okay," she said. "Go on out. The east gate is the one with the orange reflector post." He found Dale Hoffman checking fence in the far corner of the east pasture, walking the wire line with a fencing tool in his back pocket, stopping at each post to test the tension with his hand in the practiced, almost unconscious way that ranchers do it, the way the body learns to assess structural integrity without the mind needing to consciously direct it. He heard the truck before he turned and watched George park along the fence line and get out. "Didn't expect to see you again," Dale said. "I have some information," George said. He leaned against the truck. "Robert Finley, he's an agricultural law attorney out of San Antonio, is willing to review your case. He thinks the lost FSA application from 2 years ago creates a procedural argument that could work in your favor. He'll do it at cost, not his standard rate." Dale looked at him for a long moment. "Why would he do that?" "Because I asked him to," George said simply. "And what does that mean? What does that mean for me going forward? What is it that you want?" The question had the quality of something that had been forming since Tuesday. The underlying anxiety of a man who has been taught by experience that generosity from people with power comes with architecture, with implied obligations, with the particular social debt that makes you beholden in ways you can't always anticipate. George looked out at the pasture. The Hereford cattle were grazing in the thin morning light, their breath making small clouds in the cool air. A caracara was sitting on a fence post 50 yards away, perfectly still, looking at nothing in particular. "Nothing," George said. "I want nothing from you." He turned back to Dale. "I'm from here. This is my country. I grew up in a house like yours, with a father like you, on land that mattered to people who are gone now. I've had a good life." A very good life. Better than I deserved in a lot of ways. He paused. I'd like to see that fence line hold. A long silence. The caracara lifted off the post and flew east. Dale turned back to the fence and tested the next post with his hand. Then he said, without looking up, "Who's the other person? You said you made some calls." Tom Abernethy, agricultural consultant out of Uvalde. He knows the FSA infrastructure in this county specifically. He and Finley are going to coordinate the filing. "That's two professionals," Dale said. "That costs real money." "I'm taking care of the fees," George said. "Don't argue with me about it." Dale stopped. He stood very still with his hand on the fence post. He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way that it was careful when he was managing something large. "Cassie can't know about this," he said. George looked at him. "Why not?" "Because she already carries too much," Dale said. "She stayed here. After her mother died, she could have gone. She had a job offer in Austin. Good school. Better pay. She stayed to help me keep this place. She works a job 40 minutes away and comes home and does ranch work half the time." He stopped. "If she finds out how bad it really is, how far it went, she'll blame herself for not knowing. She'll blame me for not telling her. And she's already—" He stopped again, and something in his face shifted, and he turned back to the fence. "She misses her mother," he said quietly. "Every single day. And she's holding it together for me, the way her mother used to. A beat. I can't have her carrying this too." George was quiet for a while. He looked at the man beside him, at the large, rough hands on the fence wire, at the set of the shoulders, at the way a person's grief and love and pride can become so intertwined that you can no longer separate them, so that the protective impulse and the concealment and the stubbornness are all just different expressions of the same fundamental thing. "All right," he said finally. "For now." Dale nodded. They stood in silence for a moment. "Walk the rest of this line with me," Dale said. George fell into step beside him. Over the next 2 weeks, things began to move. Robert Finley drove down to Driscoll Creek on a Saturday. His own idea, not something George had suggested, and sat with Dale at the kitchen table for 3 hours, going through every document with the methodical thoroughness of a man for whom precision was a form of respect. He identified 4 procedural irregularities in the bank's foreclosure filing, filed a formal objection with the court on Monday, and simultaneously submitted a reconstructed FSA emergency loan modification application with a detailed account of the lost original filing attached as evidence. Tom Abernethy filed a drought-related livestock disaster assistance application with the FSA regional office in San Antonio, substantiated by weather data, satellite imagery of the pasture degradation, and USDA records for Frio County. Records that Tom could access and interpret because he had spent 20 years learning the specific language that the system responded to. The application covered approximately $18,000 in livestock losses over the drought period. These 2 actions, combined, did not solve the problem, but they reframed it from an uncontested foreclosure proceeding to a contested legal matter with federal assistance applications pending, which changed the bank's calculus significantly. Banks do not want contested litigation involving federal program claims. They want to close files, not open them. George was in Driscoll Creek on 4 separate occasions during those 2 weeks. Never announced. He always stopped at the roundup first and had coffee with Linda Pruitt, whose real role in the town was becoming clearer to him. She was a central node of community information, the person who knew whose truck was parked where and what it meant, who was struggling and who was managing, and what the current weather of the town's collective spirit felt like. She had run the roundup for 22 years since her husband Raymond had died of a heart attack at 51, and she ran it not primarily as a business, but as a social institution, a place where the community maintained its coherence by having somewhere to sit together. "You know you're not fooling anyone, right?" she said to him on his third visit, refilling his coffee with the automatic grace of 22 years of practice. "What do you mean?" George asked. "People know who you are," she said. "Bobby Callahan, Roy's younger brother, the one who fixes everybody's trucks, recognized you on your second visit. He told Roy. Roy told me." She set the coffee pot down. "This is a small town, George." George looked at her. "Has Dale heard?" "Bobby and Roy both know better than to say anything to Dale directly," Linda said. "And nobody's talking to the press, if that's what you're worried about. People here can keep a thing quiet when quiet is what's needed." She looked at him steadily. "But they know. And they're—" She stopped and looked for the word. "Grateful isn't quite right. It's something bigger than that. It's like when somebody from outside comes back and treats your place like it matters, like it's worth coming back to." She paused. "You understand what I mean?" "I think so," George said. "This town has been slowly losing its reason to stay together," she said. "Every time something leaves, the school, a family, a working ranch, it gets a little harder to remember why anybody stays. And then you show up and you just act like it matters. Like the Hoffman place matters. Like Dale matters." She looked at him directly. "It does something. I can't explain it better than that." It was on George's fourth visit to Driscoll Creek that he met Roy Callahan, the county sheriff, in the parking lot of the Roundup. Roy was 58, broad-shouldered and slow-moving in the way of large men who have learned that deliberateness reads as authority, with a face that was weathered and kind and professionally neutral all at the same time. He was leaning against his cruiser, drinking coffee from a to-go cup when George pulled in. Roy looked at George. George looked at Roy. "Sheriff," George said. "Mr. Strait," Roy said. George almost smiled. "You've been waiting. I figured you'd come back around," Roy said. "You want to walk a bit?" They walked down the county road shoulder in the morning light, past the feed store and the post office, and the church with its marquee, which now read, "The smallest act of kindness is worth more than the grandest intention." "I want to tell you something about Dale Hoffman," Roy said, after they had walked about 100 yards in companionable silence. "Something you should know." "All right," George said. 15 years ago, when the economy went bad and people were losing things everywhere, there were 3 families in this county that were going to lose everything. I mean everything. House, land, equipment, animals, everything." He paused. Dale Hoffman personally lent money to 2 of them. Not charity, loans, with no interest and no timeline, just pay me when you can. One of those families paid him back over 7 years. The other never could. Dale never said a word about it. Never asked for it back. When the man came to him 10 years later, still carrying guilt about it, Dale told him he didn't remember what he was talking about. Roy paused. He wasn't a wealthy man even then. He did it because he could, and because it was the right thing. George was quiet. And when his wife, when Patricia was sick, during the last 2 years, this community showed up for them. We brought food. We helped with the cattle. We drove her to her treatments in San Antonio, because that's what you do. That's what Dale had always done for everyone else. Roy stopped walking and looked at George. He doesn't know how to receive that kind of thing. He's better at giving it. Most people who are good at giving are terrible at receiving. You probably know something about that. George looked at him. Roy looked back with the even gaze of a man who says what he means, because he stopped having time for indirection about 20 years ago. "What you're doing?" I want you to know it's not just about $64,000 and a piece of land. It's about whether this community gets to keep its best person." He picked up his coffee. "That's all I wanted to say." It was also during this period that George met Craig Ellison. Craig was 34, lanky and perpetually tired-looking in the way of people who run small weekly newspapers entirely by themselves, which is what Craig did. The Frio County Record had a circulation of 847 and was published every Thursday. And Craig wrote all the articles, took all the photographs, sold all the advertising, and laid out every page himself on a 12-year-old iMac in the back of a building that had once been a hardware store. He was also, George discovered, a genuinely good journalist, in the way that only journalists who know their community intimately can be. He understood the story behind the story, the relationship between the visible and the invisible in the life of a small town. Craig found George in the parking lot of Pemberton's feed store on a Wednesday afternoon, where George had gone to ask about hay prices and delivery logistics for the Hoffman place, a practical matter he was quietly arranging without announcing it as such. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know who you are," Craig said, with the directness of a man who has neither the time nor the talent for circuitousness. "And I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you've been doing out here." George looked at him. "I also want you to know," Craig said, "that I'm not going to write about it. Not yet. Not without your permission. And not without Dale's." He paused. "But I wanted to meet you, because I think what's happening here is important. And I've spent 10 years writing about what this county is losing. I'd like to write about something it's keeping, when the time comes." George looked at the young man in front of him, at the press credential on a lanyard around his neck that said Frio County Record, at the notebook in his back pocket, at the eyes that were tired and bright at the same time, with the particular energy of a person who cares about something that doesn't pay well. "When the time comes," George said. "If it comes." "It'll come," Craig said. He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and handed it over. "Just when it does. I'd like to be there." George took the card. On the last Friday of October, Robert Finley called with news. The bank had agreed to a 90-day stay of foreclosure proceedings pending review of the FSA modification application. The procedural objections had created enough legal friction that the bank's counsel had recommended accommodation over litigation. The FSA drought assistance application had been formally received and assigned a case number, which Tom Abernethy took as a moderately encouraging sign. $64,000 remained. But the clock had stopped. George sat in his truck in the driveway of the Hoffman house and called Dale with the news. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone after he finished speaking. Then Dale said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, "George." "Yeah. Why are you doing this?" George looked out at the pecan trees in front of the house, at the old limestone walls, at the covered porch, where a wooden rocking chair sat occupied by nothing but afternoon light. "Because somebody should," he said. Another silence. When Dale spoke again, his voice had a quality that George recognized from a lifetime of knowing proud men. The sound a man makes when he is accepting something he can't repay, and deciding to accept it anyway, and the dignity and the difficulty of that decision are audible in every syllable. "Thank you," Dale said. "Don't thank me yet," George said. "We've got work to do." The second week of November arrived with the kind of weather that Texas uses to remind people that its seasons do not follow national conventions. The cold front that came through on a Sunday night dropped temperatures 30 degrees in 6 hours, and by Monday morning the sky was low and pewter-colored, and a thin sleet was ticking against the windows of the Hoffman house, in a way that would have been beautiful if it hadn't also been threatening to ice the county road and make Cassie's drive to Pearsall genuinely dangerous. Cassie Hoffman left for school at 6:45 anyway. Dale stood on the porch and watched her taillights disappear down the Caliche Road, and felt the particular helplessness of a parent watching a child navigate a world they can't entirely protect them from. A feeling that had not gotten easier since Cassie was 17 and had not gotten easier after Patricia died, had in fact gotten considerably worse, because now he was the only one standing between Cassie and the full weight of the situation he'd gotten them both into. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee. The manila envelope with the bank documents was in the kitchen drawer. He'd stopped keeping it on the table. Robert Finley had told him last week that the stay of proceedings was confirmed in writing, that the FSA modification application was moving through the review process, that there was reason for cautious optimism. Dale had received this information and put it in the same internal drawer where he put most things that required him to feel something complicated. Filed it, put the face back on, kept moving. He was still sitting at the table 40 minutes later, on his second cup of coffee, when his phone rang. It was George. "I need to tell you something," George said without preamble. "And I need you to hear it all the way through before you react." Dale set down his coffee cup. "All right. I've been in touch with some people," George said. "People I know through music, through charity work, through the Farm Bureau. I've talked to some of them about the situation here. Not your name, not your specifics, just the general situation. The kind of situation." A pause. "There are people who want to help. Not in a way that involves anything public, not in a way that requires you to do anything uncomfortable. But there's money available. Grant money, agricultural foundation money, not personal charity, that could cover the delinquent amount entirely." Silence on Dale's end. "Dale," George said. "I heard you," Dale said. "Say something." A long pause. When Dale spoke, his voice was the flattest George had ever heard it. "I don't want to be a cause," he said. "I don't want people looking at me like I don't want that." "No one is looking at you like anything," George said. "These are foundations that exist specifically to help farms in crisis. Agricultural Heritage Preservation Funds, Texas-specific rural assistance organizations. This is what they do. You would not be the first person who received this kind of help, and you wouldn't be the last." He paused. "Robert says the grant pathway, combined with the FSA modification, could resolve the delinquency entirely and restructure the remaining note at a rate that's actually manageable on current cattle prices." Another silence. George waited. "Cassie," Dale said finally. "What about her?" "She'd have to know." "Yes," George said. "At some point, she'd have to know." The silence that followed was different from the others. Denser, with something moving inside it. George heard Dale breathe in slowly and breathe out. "She's going to be angry at me," Dale said, "for not telling her, for letting it go this far." "Probably," George said. "She's going to feel like I didn't trust her." "Probably," George said again. "And you're going to have to sit with that and let her be angry, and then explain it to her." He paused. "She'll understand, eventually, because she knows you." A very long silence. "How soon?" Dale asked. "Robert thinks we should move the grant application forward this week if possible," George said. "The fiscal year for most of these foundations closes in December. We miss this window. We wait another year. And the bank? The stay runs to mid-February. If the grant covers the delinquency and the FSA modification is approved, the bank's legal exposure for continuing the foreclosure becomes very uncomfortable. Robert thinks they'll settle." A pause. "But it requires you to sign some paperwork this week, and it requires Cassie to co-sign as a property heir, which means she has to know." The sleet was still ticking against the windows. Outside, the sky had gone from pewter to the color of old iron. "I'll talk to her tonight," Dale said quietly. George drove to Driscoll Creek on Wednesday. He hadn't intended to be present for the conversation between Dale and Cassie. That was not his place. And he understood that with the precision of a man who has spent decades knowing which spaces are his and which belong to other people. But Dale had called him Tuesday evening and said simply, "She wants to talk to you." He pulled into the Hoffman yard at 4 in the afternoon. As the early winter dark was beginning to settle, the porch light was on. Through the kitchen window he could see the warm yellow light of the interior and two shapes moving. He knocked. Cassie opened the door. She had clearly been crying at some point during the day. Not recently, but the signs were there in the slight puffiness around her eyes and the particular set of her jaw, which was her father's jaw and wore his determination but with something raw underneath it. She looked at George for a moment with an expression that was complex and unguarded. "Come in," she said. Dale was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked older than he had the first day George had seen him at the roundup, which was not because anything had changed in his face, but because George now knew what was behind the face. And knowledge changes perception. He had both hands flat on the table again, but this time he looked up when George came in and didn't look away. "I know this isn't easy," George said, taking his hat off and sitting down across from Dale. "She was pretty upset last night," Dale said. He looked at Cassie, who had sat down at the end of the table. "She has a right to be." "I'm not—" Cassie started and stopped. She looked at her hands. "I'm not angry the way he thought I'd be. I mean, yes, I'm angry. But more than that, I'm—" She stopped again. And in the pause, the thing she was trying to name moved across her face clearly. It was fear, transmuted by the news that the feared thing had been happening all along without her knowledge, into something that was retrospective and therefore somehow worse. "I was here," she said. "I was right here the whole time. And I didn't know." "That's on me," Dale said immediately. "Not on you. I know that," she said. "But it doesn't make it feel better." She looked at George. "He says you've been out here 4 times. "About that," George said. "And you've got an attorney and a consultant working on this?" "Yes." "And there are grants available?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were very dark and very direct. "Why?" she asked. "I know what you told him, but I want to hear it from you directly." George looked at her. He thought about what to say, and then he said what was actually true, instead of the polished version of it. "My daughter died in 1986, he said. She was 13 years old. Her name was Jennifer, with 1 N. He paused. "After she died, there were people who showed up. People who didn't make a thing of it, didn't need to be thanked, didn't explain themselves. They just appeared and did what needed doing, and then went away." He paused again. "I've never forgotten that, and I've been in a position for a long time where I can do that for other people. And when I came through here and saw your father at that table—" He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. "I didn't think about it very much," he said honestly. "I just did it." Cassie looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, but opened, the way a door opens rather than melts. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," Dale said. "Okay," she said again. She looked at her father. "We signed the paperwork." The grant applications were filed the following Friday. Robert Finley submitted a combined package: the Agricultural Heritage Preservation Grant application, the FSA Emergency Modification Request with the reconstructed documentation, and a formal response to the bank's foreclosure filing that cited 7 specific procedural irregularities and attach the pending federal assistance documentation as supporting material. Tom Abernethy coordinated the FSA side and provided a detailed economic impact assessment of the Hoffman operation within the context of Frio County's agricultural ecosystem. It was, Robert told George afterward, among the most complete applications he had assembled in 30 years of practice. The response came faster than anyone expected. On a Thursday morning, 10 days after the filing, Tom Abernethy called George at 8 in the morning with his voice at a pitch that George had not heard from him before. Not calm, not calculating, but vibrating with something that took George a moment to identify as genuine surprise. "The FSA regional director called me personally," Tom said. "The application hit the desk of someone who apparently has strong feelings about Frio County's agricultural decline. They're fast-tracking the disaster assistance. The check will be approximately $22,000, available within 30 days. A pause. "And the Agricultural Heritage Preservation Fund? They called this morning, too. They're approving the full grant, $48,000. George was sitting in his truck outside a grocery store in San Antonio. He held the phone and listened to the number. 22,000 plus 48,000. $70,000. "That covers the delinquency," George said. "With 6,000 left over," Tom said. "And the FSA is simultaneously approving the loan modification on the outstanding principal. The new rate and term are actually, I'll send you the details, but the monthly payment drops to something manageable. Like, genuinely manageable." George sat with this for a moment. Outside the grocery store, people were going in and out with carts, living their ordinary lives on an ordinary Thursday morning. A woman was struggling with a cart that had a wobbly wheel. A kid was sitting on the curb eating a granola bar. "Tom," George said. "Yeah, thank you," he said. "Genuinely." "Don't thank me," Tom said. "Thank whoever has feelings about Frio County's agricultural decline." He paused. "Also, this is the most satisfying file I've worked in about 8 years. So, thank you." George called Dale. The phone rang 4 times and then a 5th. And George was beginning to think he'd have to leave a voicemail when Dale picked up, slightly out of breath, with background noise that suggested he'd run from somewhere to get to the phone. "George," he said. "I've got some news," George said. He told him. The silence that followed was the longest silence in any of their conversations. George sat in the grocery store parking lot and waited. When Dale finally spoke, his voice was not the flat, controlled voice that George had come to recognize as his baseline register. It was something else entirely, fractured slightly at the edges. The careful structure of it not quite holding. "That covers it," Dale said. "Yes," George said. "The whole thing." "Yes." Another silence. "Cassie," Dale said. "Call her," George said. "Call her right now." He heard Dale breathe in sharply once, the way a person breathes in when something very large passes through them. Then, "All right." And then, "George." "Don't," George said gently. "I have to say it," Dale said. "I have to say, thank you. I know you don't want to hear it, but I have to say it anyway." George looked out the windshield at the parking lot. A crow had landed on the hood of the car next to his and was looking at him with one bright black eye. "You're welcome, Dale," he said. "Go call your daughter." 3 days after Dale Hoffman received the official grant approval letters in the mail, Cassie Hoffman did something that her father had not anticipated and that would set in motion a sequence of events that neither of them could have predicted. She told Linda Pruitt. Not all of it. Not George Strait's name. Not the full financial picture. She told her the way a person tells a close friend the broad shape of something enormous when the enormity of it has become too large to carry alone. standing at the counter of the Roundup on a Saturday morning before the breakfast rush, with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and her voice very quiet. She told Linda that her father had been in serious trouble and that someone had helped them in a way that was, and here she searched for the word and used the one that felt most accurate, extraordinary. Linda Pruitt listened with the complete, practiced attention of a person who has spent 22 years being the person in town that people tell things to. When Cassie finished, Linda refilled her coffee and said nothing for a moment, looking out the front window at the empty county road. Then she said, "We all knew something was happening." Cassie looked at her. "What do you mean?" "When he started coming through," Linda said, "we all knew. Not because we're nosy." She paused, and the corner of her mouth moved slightly. "Well, we are, but that's not why. We knew because when somebody cares about something, you can see it. And every time he came back, you could see that he cared." She looked at Cassie. "This town needed to see that. You have no idea how much it needed to see that." Cassie looked at her. "What are you thinking?" Linda looked back out the window. She had the expression of a person in whom an idea is forming, slow and deliberate, the way water finds its level. "I'm thinking," she said, "that there might be a way to say thank you that would mean something." Linda Pruitt called Pastor Wicker that afternoon. Pastor Wicker called Roy Callahan. Roy Callahan called Tom Pemberton, whose family had run Pemberton's feed store since 1948, and who was 79 years old, and still came in every morning at 7:30, and left at noon with the unhurried authority of a man who has earned the right to set his own schedule. Tom Pemberton called his daughter Beth Pemberton Krause, who had married a man from Castroville and come back to Driscoll Creek 20 years ago, and was now, at 47, the closest thing the town had to an event organizer, having run the 4th of July barbecue and the Christmas tree lighting for 15 consecutive years. Craig Ellison was called on Sunday. By Monday, what had begun as Linda Pruitt's half-formed thought on a Saturday morning had become something with shape and momentum. Not a plan exactly, not yet, but the precondition for a plan. A group of people who had all been separately carrying the same gratitude and now had each other's permission to act on it. The question was how. That question was answered, as most questions in small towns are answered, in a conversation at the Roundup on a Tuesday morning, with Linda's coffee on the table and Beth Pemberton Krause's legal pad open in front of her with a list of names down the left margin. "It has to be something real," Beth said. "Not a plaque, not a certificate. Something that means something." "A concert," Roy said, from the end of the counter, not looking up from his coffee. Everyone looked at him. "Think about it," he said, now looking up. "The man is George Strait. You don't thank George Strait with a framed certificate. You thank him the way he thanks people, through music, through something that belongs to him and belongs to this place at the same time." He set his mug down. "We organize a community concert, right here, on the Hoffman property. Invite everyone from the county. And then we tell him and we ask him to come." A silence settled over the table, the particular silence of people encountering an idea that is simultaneously obvious and enormous. "He might say no," Craig said. "He might," Roy agreed. "But I think he won't." Linda looked at Beth. Beth looked at her legal pad. Pastor Wicker, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his expression serene in the way of men who have made peace with uncertainty, said quietly, "I think Roy's right." "Who asks him?" Cassie said. She had been sitting at the edge of the group, quiet until now, with her coffee and her particular watchfulness. Everyone looked at her. "It should be my dad," she said. "It should come from him." Dale Hoffman drove to San Antonio on a Wednesday. He had called George the night before and asked if they could meet. Not to talk business, just to talk. And George had said yes without asking why. They met at a diner on the north side of the city, not far from the arena where George had performed more times than either of them could count. It was an ordinary diner, nothing remarkable about it. The kind of place where the coffee comes in an unlimited refill pot, and the pie is better than it has any right to be. Dale sat across from George and folded his hands on the table in a way that George recognized as the physical posture of a man who is about to say something that has required a significant amount of preparation. "The town wants to do something," Dale said. "For you." George looked at him. "That's not necessary." "I know," Dale said. "They know. They're going to do it anyway." He paused. "A concert. On my property. For the whole county. They want you to perform." He looked at George steadily. "Not as a favor to me, as they want it to be a celebration of something. Of the fact that the place is still standing. That the community is still standing." He paused again. Cassie's idea was that it could also raise some money. There are 2 other families in the county who are in trouble. Not as far along as we were, but heading that direction. The county's agricultural relief fund is basically empty. If the concert raised enough, how much would help? George asked. Dale looked at him. Roy says if they could get $80,000 into the relief fund, they could help the 2 families through to spring. Give them time to restructure. George was quiet for a moment. He looked out the diner window at the San Antonio traffic. Then he looked back at Dale. "Tell me about the 2 families," he said. Dale told him. The Kirby family, Ned and Dorothy Kirby, were 4th-generation cattle ranchers in the northwest part of the county in their mid-60s, whose situation was almost identical to Dale's own 12 months ago. The Vasquez family, Carlos and Anita Vasquez, ran a small agricultural operation with goats and sheep. 40 years on the same land, facing a combination of drought losses and a medical debt from Carlos's hospitalization the previous spring. George listened to all of it. "Saturday after Thanksgiving," he said. Dale looked at him. "What?" "The concert. Saturday after Thanksgiving. That gives people time to come from around the region if they want to." He looked at Dale. "You have enough flat ground on the south pasture for a stage and a good crowd." "Yes," Dale said. "Tell Beth Pemberton Krause I'll handle the stage and sound equipment," George said. "She doesn't need to worry about that." Dale stared at him. "How do you know about Beth?" George almost smiled. "Roy told me," he said. "We've been talking. News travels at the speed of community, which is faster than the news thinks, and slower than social media pretends. And it travels in the specific channels of personal relationship, the phone calls between people who trust each other, the conversations at feed stores and church parking lots, and the counter of the roundup. Within 48 hours of Dale's conversation with George, the entire town of Driscoll Creek knew. Within a week, word had spread through Frio County, and then into the neighboring counties. And then, because Craig Ellison wrote a careful, restrained, and beautiful 3-paragraph item in the Frio County Record that said only that a benefit concert was being organized on the Hoffman property in Driscoll Creek for the Saturday after Thanksgiving, that the proceeds would support the Frio County Agricultural Relief Fund, and that there was a special musical performance expected. Word spread further than that. Craig had chosen his words with a precision born of knowing exactly what he was doing. He did not name George Strait. He did not need to. In South Texas, in the networks of people who knew this landscape and this music and this community, special musical performance on the Hoffman property in Driscoll Creek in the week after Thanksgiving meant exactly one thing. The calls started coming in to Beth Pemberton Krause's phone on a Thursday morning and did not stop. Meanwhile, on the Hoffman property, things were changing. The grant money had been received and applied to the delinquent loan balance. Robert Finley had executed the restructured loan agreement with First Southwest Agricultural Lending. And the terms were, as Tom Abernethy had described them, genuinely manageable. The property was no longer at risk. The FSA drought assistance payment had arrived and gone directly into hay and supplemental feed for the cattle, which were already beginning to show improvement. Their ribs less visible, their movement more purposeful. The particular vitality returning to an animal that has been properly fed after a period of deprivation. With money freed from the frantic, crisis-level expenditure of keeping the operation barely alive, Dale had been able to begin addressing the deferred maintenance that had accumulated during the hardest years. Fencing that needed tensioning, the stock tank that needed the inlet pipe repaired, the barn roof that had 2 sections of tin that had been lifting in high wind and threatening to peel back entirely. Cassie had begun helping in the evenings with a different quality of presence. Not the grim, purposeful practicality of someone working against an invisible deadline, but something lighter. She came home from school and changed her clothes and came out to the barn, or the pens, or the fence line. And she and her father worked together in the long golden light of the Texas late afternoon, with the specific ease of 2 people who have stopped managing their fear long enough to simply be where they are. One evening, about a week before Thanksgiving, Cassie was replacing a section of wooden fence rail along the north pasture, while Dale held it level, and she said, without looking up from the nail she was driving, "Mom would have liked him." Dale held the rail and thought about this for a moment. "She would have found it very funny," he said. "George Strait sitting at this table drinking bad coffee." "Our coffee is not bad," Cassie said. "It is a little bad," Dale said. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes out of a person when they haven't laughed in a while, and the laugh arrives before the guard can stop it. Sudden and genuine, and slightly surprised at itself. Dale heard it and felt something move in his chest. "She would have made good coffee for him," Cassie said, recovering. "She would have made the good stuff, and she would have made him a pie." "She would have made him at least 2 pies," Dale said. They worked in silence for a moment. The evening was cold, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east, sharp and close in the dry air. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," Dale said, without announcement. He had said it before. He said it again because it still needed saying. Cassie drove another nail. "I know," she said. "I thought I was protecting you." "I know you did," she said. She set the hammer down and looked at him across the fence rail. The fading light was on her face, and she looked, for a moment, so much like Patricia that it required a specific effort for Dale to keep his expression steady. "That's what you do," she said, not unkindly. "You protect people. You just sometimes forget that the people you're protecting are strong enough to be told the truth." Dale held the fence rail and didn't say anything. "We're okay now," she said. She picked the hammer back up. "That's what matters." The week before Thanksgiving, Roy Callahan drove out to the Hoffman place on a Tuesday with his brother, Bobby Callahan, and 3 men from the church to begin preparing the south pasture for the concert. Bobby was 51, shorter and broader than his brother, with mechanical ingenuity that had made him the default repair person for half the county's farm equipment, and he had a specific talent for solving logistical problems with whatever materials were available and a minimum of complaint. They mowed the south pasture flat, cleared the mesquite along the eastern edge to create a natural amphitheater effect, and laid out a grid for parking using cedar posts and orange flagging tape that somehow looked both improvised and exactly right. Tom Pemberton donated the lumber for the stage platform from his store's surplus, and Bobby Callahan built it in 2 days with help from his 2 teenage sons. George's people, A small production crew from San Antonio arrived on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving to assess the site and begin rigging the sound system and lighting. The crew chief, a woman named Diane Torres, who had worked George's events for 15 years, walked the South Pasture with Bobby Callahan, and the two of them spent 45 minutes in deep technical conversation that mixed professional audio engineering terminology with South Texas ranching vernacular in a way that was somehow entirely coherent. Cassie watched all of this from the porch of the house and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something she recognized slowly, the way you recognize a color you haven't seen in years. It was pride. Not pride in any specific thing. Pride in the place itself, in the land, in the family that had stayed on it. The feeling that this particular piece of the earth was worth something, was worth the work, was worth the trouble, was worth the fighting for, and that other people knew it too. She sat on the porch in the cold November air and let herself feel it, without qualifying it. The night before Thanksgiving, George Strait sat in his kitchen in San Antonio and did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He wrote a song. Not on a guitar. He'd done that plenty. He wrote it on a piece of paper, longhand at the kitchen table, with a pen that ran dry halfway through and had to be replaced with another one from the drawer. He wrote it slowly, crossing out lines and rewriting them, going back and adjusting a word, changing a rhyme because the first one was technically correct, but emotionally false. It wasn't the kind of song he'd normally record. It wasn't built for radio. It was too specific, too attached to a particular landscape and a particular set of people and a particular moment in time. It was the kind of song that existed to be sung once, in the right place, to the right people. He finished it at 11:30 and read it back twice. Then he went to bed. The Saturday after Thanksgiving arrived the way the best days in South Texas arrive in late autumn. Cold and clear and absolutely still, with a sky that was so intensely blue it seemed to have a physical quality, a density, as though the blue went all the way through, and there was nothing behind it but more blue. The temperature at 7 in the morning was 34 degrees. By noon, it would be 58. By 3 in the afternoon, when people began arriving, it was a perfect 53, cold enough for a coat, warm enough to take it off if you were working. They came from Driscoll Creek first, then from Pearsall and Dilley and Cotulla, then from Carrizo Springs and Laredo and Uvalde, then from San Antonio, 3 hours north, in a steady stream of trucks and SUVs and the occasional car that looked slightly out of place on the Caliche County Road. Craig Ellison stood at the entrance to the South Pasture with his camera and counted, because that was what he did, and stopped counting at about 1,100 people because he ran out of reliable capacity to count, and the parking area was still filling. The stage that Bobby Callahan had built was transformed by Diane Torres's crew. The simple lumber platform was now flanked by professional speaker towers and lit by a warm golden wash that made the whole scene look, in the late afternoon light, like something from a painting. Behind the stage, the open rangeland stretched south for miles, and the fading light was on the dry grass and the mesquite and the distant tree line of the creek. And the whole landscape had the quality of something that has always been there and intends to keep being there. Beth Pemberton Krause had organized the food situation with the comprehensive authority of a woman who had run 15 consecutive 4th of July barbecues. And what that meant in practical terms was that there were 6 large grills going along the east edge of the pasture, staffed by volunteers from the church and the feed store and the post office, producing brisket and sausage and chicken and the specific smoky sweet smell that is the olfactory signature of a Texas community gathering. A smell that bypasses the conscious mind and goes directly to some older, more fundamental part of the brain that recognizes it as This is where your people are. Dale Hoffman stood near the stage in his good shirt. Not the work shirt, the good one, the blue one that Patricia had given him for his 60th birthday, and watched people arrive with an expression that he was clearly struggling to maintain at neutral. Cassie stood beside him. She had her arm through his and her head slightly toward his shoulder, not quite resting on it, the way adult children stand with aging parents when they want to be close without making a thing of it. She was wearing her mother's earrings, small silver pieces, simple, that she had not worn since the funeral. She had put them on this morning without planning to, had looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, and seen her mother's face in hers, in the way that happens sometimes and is simultaneously painful and sustaining. And she had left the earrings in. Roy Callahan was in uniform, not because anyone expected trouble, but because Roy Callahan's idea of respect for a significant occasion was to be fully and formally present. He was stationed near the gate with Bobby, and his manner was unhurried and authoritative in the way that kept everything moving without anyone feeling moved. Linda Pruitt was not working today. For the first time in memory, she had closed the roundup for the afternoon and was here as a person, not as a diner operator, wearing a red coat she had owned for 20 years and standing near the front with Tom Pemberton, who was 79 and had been helped from the parking area by his granddaughter and was standing on somewhat uncertain legs, but with the expression of a man who has no intention of sitting down. Pastor Wicker was near the back with several members of his congregation, his hands clasped in front of him and his expression holding the specific quality of peaceful anticipation that he had cultivated over 34 years of ministry. The capacity to be fully present in a moment without needing it to be anything other than what it is. Craig Ellison was everywhere at once, as he always was, his camera around his neck and his notebook in his back pocket, moving through the crowd with the efficient invisibility of a small-town journalist who knows how to be present without intruding. Robert Finley had driven down from San Antonio with his wife. Tom Abernethy had come from Uvalde. They stood together near the stage, two professional men who had done professional work. And in the context of this gathering, that work had a different weight than it had in their offices. Here it was visible, not as documents and filings, but as a family standing near a stage on their own land, and the land still theirs. Ned and Dorothy Kirby were there, from the northwest of the county. Carlos and Anita Vasquez were there. They had been told that a portion of the concert proceeds was designated for the Frio County Agricultural Relief Fund, and they understood without being told directly what that meant for them. They had come with the particular gratitude of people who have been given time. Not a solution, not a guarantee, but time, which is the fundamental currency of farming and of life. George arrived at 4:15. He came in a truck, the old one, the F-250 with the dent and the cracked leather, and he parked in the regular parking area and walked to the stage without announcement, wearing what he always wore when he wasn't performing. And then, when he got to the stage and Diane Torres handed him his guitar, simply kept wearing. No costume change, no production, just the man and the instrument and the place. He stepped up on the stage at 4:30. The crowd, 1,100+ people spread across the south pasture of the Hoffman property in the cold, clear, perfect Texas afternoon, went very still. George looked out at them for a moment. He looked at the landscape behind them, at the native grass and the mesquite and the live oaks and the dry creek bed and the water tower in the distance and the enormous sky above all of it. He looked at the stage Bobby Callahan had built from Tom Pemberton's surplus lumber. He looked at Dale and Cassie Hoffman standing near the front, and at Linda Pruitt in her red coat, and at Roy Callahan in his uniform, and at Pastor Wicker in the back, and at Craig Ellison with his camera, and at Robert Finley and Tom Abernethy, and at Ned and Dorothy Kirby, and at Carlos and Anita Vasquez, and at 1,100 other people who had come from the ranches and the towns and the roads of Frio County and its neighbors because something was happening here that was worth coming to. He adjusted the microphone. "I grew up in Pearsall," he said. His voice was conversational, not performing. 30 miles that way." He gestured northwest with his chin. "I've been all over this country and most of the world, and I've played arenas and stadiums and venues that seat 40,000 people." He paused. "And I have played some of those shows and felt, at the end of them, like something was missing, like the music was going out and nothing was coming back." He looked out at the crowd. "This is about as small as it gets, what we've got here." He looked at Dale. "And it is the most I have felt the point of doing this in about 15 years. A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite applause. Something more involuntary than that. A sound that large groups of people make when something true is said in front of them. "I'm going to start," George said, "with something I wrote Thursday night." He settled the guitar on his knee. "It doesn't have a title yet. I'm calling it by the name of this place for now." He began to play. The song was not a performance in the sense that his concerts were performances. It was more like a spoken letter, set to a melody that was simple enough that the words were never subordinate to it. It described a house built from post oak lumber in 1947 by a man coming back from war. It described 4 generations of hands on the same gate, the same fence wire, the same water trough. It described a woman who got sick, and a man who stayed, and a daughter who stayed too, and the particular dignity of choosing to stay in a place when the easier and perhaps smarter thing would be to go. It described the dry creek bed, and the thinning grass, and the low water in the tank, and what it looks like when a piece of land is fighting for its life, and why that fight is worth witnessing. It did not describe George Strait himself. It was not about him. It was about the land and the family and the community, but in the way that the best country songs work, not by stating what they mean, but by showing it, by accumulating specific and true detail until the specific becomes universal. It was also about everyone in that pasture who had ever loved a particular piece of the earth and been afraid of losing it, which, in South Texas in November, on a piece of land bordered by the rangeland of Frio County, was essentially everyone present. Craig Ellison, standing at the back of the crowd with his camera at his side, realized after about 90 seconds that he had stopped taking photographs. He was just listening. Linda Pruitt, standing near the front in her red coat, was crying without being aware of having started. Cassie Hoffman was looking at her father. Dale was looking at the stage, and his face was not controlled, not managed, not the flat, carefully maintained surface of a man holding himself together. It was open. It was the face of a man who has put down something very heavy and has not yet remembered to pick it back up. When the song ended, there was silence for a moment that lasted longer than most silences last. Then, the sound that came from 1,100 people was not the polite, trained applause of an arena audience. It was something rougher and more genuine. The sound of people who have been in the presence of something that was for them specifically, for their particular lives and landscape and losses and loves, and who are responding to it with the only instrument they have. George looked out at them and took his hat off and held it at his side. He played for 90 minutes. He played the songs that every person in that pasture had heard 1,000 times, and still heard as though for the first time. The songs that belong to the landscape they were written from, that carry in their chord structures The wide flat spaces, and the blue sky, and the cattle, and the honest, unglamorous effort of life on the land. He played them not with the elevated precision of a stadium performance, but with the loosened, intimate quality of a man playing for people he knows, in a place he knows, with nothing between him and the audience but open air and 50 feet of South Texas rangeland. Between songs, he said very little. He didn't need to. The music was the communication. Near the end of the set, he stopped and looked out at the crowd and said, "I'm going to ask Dale Hoffman to come up here for a minute." A sound from the crowd. Surprise, anticipation. Dale looked at Cassie. Cassie looked at him with an expression that said, "Go." He walked up to the stage with the deliberate, unhurried step of a man who is not going to let being watched change how he walks. He was taller than he looked from a distance. He stood beside George and looked out at the crowd and had the expression of a man who has been asked to inhabit a spotlight when his entire nature is oriented toward the opposite. George turned to the crowd. "This is Dale Hoffman," he said. "This is his land. His family built this place in 1947, and it has been standing ever since, and it is going to keep standing." He looked at Dale. "Because some things are worth fighting for, and some places are worth coming back to. And the people who stay and tend and hold on deserve to have someone say that out loud." He turned back to the crowd. "This community built something," George said. "This community showed up for this family the way this family has showed up for this community for 4 generations. And what you built is still standing." He paused. "That's not a small thing. Don't ever let anyone tell you it is." The applause that came was long. Dale stood beside George and looked out at the faces of people he had known his entire life. Linda Pruitt and Roy Callahan and Tom Pemberton and Pastor Wicker and the Kirbys and the Vasquezes and Craig Ellison and Beth Pemberton Krause and 100 others, all of them looking back at him. And the quality of the way they were looking at him was something he had no ready category for. It was not pity. It was not charity. It was the specific way a community looks at one of its own when it wants that person to know they are seen and valued and not alone. He stood there and received it, which was the hardest thing he had done in a very long time and the most necessary. Cassie, standing at the front of the crowd, watched her father's face. She saw the moment when he stopped managing it, when the long-held discipline of a proud man keeping himself together in public finally, quietly, let go. Not in a visible way, not dramatically, but in the way a door swings open when the latch is released. A barely perceptible shift in the whole structure of the face. His jaw unclenched. His shoulders dropped a quarter inch. His eyes, looking out at the community he had lived in and worked for and loved in the way that quiet, undemonstrative people love, the way that shows in action rather than words, went bright. He didn't cry, but he came close enough that Cassie, who knew his face better than any face in the world, could see exactly where the line was. She put her hand over her mouth and looked at the sky for a moment. After the concert, as the crowd began to move toward the food area and the natural, unhurried social life of an outdoor gathering in the late afternoon, George came down from the stage and found Dale and Cassie waiting for him near the stage steps. The 3 of them stood together for a moment without speaking. Then Cassie said, "The song. You like it?" George asked. She looked at him with the direct, unguarded eyes that he had noticed the first day he met her. "My mother would have loved it," she said. "She would have made you sing it twice." George looked at her. What was she like? And Cassie told him, standing there in the cold November light as the crowd moved around them. She told him about Patricia Hoffman, who had been a reader of serious books and a terrible singer, and a magnificent cook, and a woman who could silence a room with a single look, but would also, without warning, find something so funny that she laughed until she cried, who had been fierce in the specific way that women who love hard places love hard, without sentiment, without performance, with the absolute commitment of someone who has chosen a life and intends to mean it. Dale listened to his daughter describe his wife and said nothing, just stood there in the cold air and let himself have it. George listened with the attention of a man who knows how to receive a story, who knows that receiving it well is its own form of tribute to the person being described. When Cassie finished, George said, "She sounds like she was exactly the right person for this place." "She was," Dale said. The final accounting, which Craig Ellison published in the Frio County Record the following Thursday, reported that the concert had raised $94,000 for the Frio County Agricultural Relief Fund, significantly more than the $80,000 that Roy Callahan had estimated would help the Kirby and Vasquez families through to spring, according to Wikipedia. The excess was deposited into a newly established fund, administered by Pastor Wicker's church and Tom Abernethy's consulting firm, designated for future agricultural emergency assistance in the county. Its first formal act was the approval of restructured assistance for the Kirby family's outstanding delinquency. Its second was the coverage of Carlos Vasquez's remaining medical debt, which was the invisible anchor dragging the family's farm finances down even after the agricultural losses had been addressed. Craig's article about the concert was picked up by the San Antonio Express-News, then by the Austin American-Statesman, then by several national outlets whose editors recognized in it the kind of story that connects to something people are hungry for. Not a story about celebrity exactly, though it was that, but a story about the specific and irreplaceable value of a place and the people who tend it, and the rare possibility of showing up for something without being asked. Britannica. George declined to be interviewed by any of the national outlets. He made one statement through a spokesperson that was 3 sentences. "This was a community event for a community I care about. The credit belongs to the people of Frio County who organized it and showed up for it. They don't need anything from me except to be left alone to keep doing what they do." This statement was widely quoted and widely misunderstood by people who read it as modesty when it was actually precision. In December, Robert Finley closed the Hoffman file. The restructured loan was executing on schedule. The FSA modification was confirmed. The property was stable, the cattle were in improved condition, and the winter hay stores, replenished partly by the FSA assistance and partly by a quiet arrangement that George had made with Pemberton's feed store that Tom Pemberton absolutely refused to discuss with anyone, were sufficient through March. Robert called George on a Thursday afternoon. "It's done," he said. "Good," George said. "You know," Robert said, "in 30 years of practice, I have never had a file that resolved this cleanly." He paused. "Usually, there's a compromise somewhere. Something that doesn't quite close. This one, everything closed." "Sometimes things work out," George said. "George." "Yeah." "What you did out there, the legal fees, the consultant fees, the hay, the concert, all of it. That's a significant amount of money and time for a man who didn't know these people 3 months ago." George was quiet for a moment. "I know them now," he said. On a Saturday morning in the middle of December, George drove down to Driscoll Creek one last time before Christmas. He didn't call ahead. He pulled into the Hoffman yard and found it quiet. Dale's truck was there, and from the barn he could hear the sound of someone working, the specific rhythmic clatter of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, moving through familiar tasks. He went to the barn. Dale was working on a broken section of hay conveyor, his hands in the mechanism with the focused efficiency of a man in his element, turning a wrench with small, deliberate movements that suggested long familiarity with the specific stubbornness of this particular machine. He heard George come in and looked up. "Hey," he said. "Hey," George said. He leaned against the barn wall with his arms folded and watched. "You need a hand? Pull that housing back for me, that panel on the left." George crossed the barn and pulled the panel back while Dale worked from the other side. And they worked together in the specific quiet of two people who have done something difficult together and are now comfortable with shared silence in a way that was not possible before. After a few minutes, Dale said, "Cassie's talking to the Austin school again." George glanced at him. "The offer's still open," Dale said. He was still looking at the mechanism in front of him, his voice careful. "Better pay, better school, more opportunities for her." He paused. "I told her to take it." "What did she say?" Dale turned a bolt and was quiet for a moment. "She said she's thinking about it." He paused. "She's been here every day for 3 years taking care of me in this place. And she's good at it, and I know she loves it. But she's 28. She should have the thing that was built for her." He looked up at George. "The place will be fine. I'll be fine. The place will outlast both of us." George held the panel and looked at him. At the man who had been sitting at a corner table in a diner 2 months ago, reading foreclosure papers with the face of someone trying not to come apart, and who was now standing in his barn with the quiet authority of a person who knows what they have and knows it will hold. "You sound like you believe that," George said. "I do," Dale said simply. He turned back to the mechanism. "I didn't always, but I do now." They worked in silence for another 20 minutes until the conveyor was repaired. Dale wiped his hands on a rag and stood back, and they both looked at the machine as though confirming that it was, in fact, fixed. "Stay for lunch," Dale said. "All right," George said. They ate at the kitchen table, sandwiches and coffee, nothing elaborate, and talked in the way that people talk when the urgent thing has passed, and what remains is just the ordinary life that was under the crisis the whole time, waiting. Dale asked about the ranch in San Antonio, and George talked about it with the specificity and pleasure of a man describing something he actually loves. The cattle, the pasture management, the dogs, the way the property looks in the early morning when the light is still low. Dale listened and asked follow-up questions that were knowledgeable and genuine, rancher to rancher, the conversation finding its level in the shared language of people who work the same kind of land. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was still bad, though slightly less bad than it had been in October, which George attributed to the fact that Cassie had recently replaced the 1985 percolator with a standard drip machine. At some point, George looked around the kitchen, at the old limestone walls, at the wooden cabinets, at the window above the sink that looked out onto the covered porch and the pecan trees and the rangeland beyond. And he said, "You're going to have to make the good coffee when Cassie goes." Dale looked at him. "She's showing me." "Good." A pause. Outside, a red-tailed hawk was riding a thermal high above the south pasture, turning in slow circles with the effortless patience of a creature that understands that the land below will always provide if you simply stay in your place and wait. "George," Dale said. George looked at him. "The song." He paused. He had both hands flat on the table in the way he had, not anxious now, just how he sat. "What you said in it about Patricia, about the woman who loved the place." He paused. "You never met her?" "No," George said. "But you got it right," Dale said. His voice was very quiet and very even. "What you said about her in the song, it was right." George looked at him for a moment. "I got it from Cassie," he said simply. She described her mother, and I listened. Dale nodded slowly. He looked down at the table. "That's what she does," he said. "She carries her mother. Every day." He looked back up, and his eyes were bright in a way that he didn't try to manage. "I don't know if you understand how much it meant to hear someone say her name in a song, in front of all those people, on this land." He stopped. It was like he searched for it. Like the land remembered her. Like the place said, she was here. She was part of this. George looked at him and felt the specific weight of what the man had just said. The particular truth of it. The way grief needs a geography, needs the places and the landscapes to remember the people who move through them, so that the dead are not only in the past, but also in the land, in the air, in the light that falls across the same pastures they walked in. She was here, George said, and she still is. Dale held his gaze for a moment, then he reached across the table and put out his hand. George took it. They shook hands. The simple, unremarkable, absolutely sufficient gesture of two men in a kitchen in South Texas, with the land outside and the light through the window and everything that needed to be said, already said, and the silence between them full of it. When George drove back up the county road toward the highway later that afternoon, he passed the mailbox with Hoffman stenciled on it in letters that were a little less flaked than they had been in October. Someone had touched up the white paint recently, carefully. Not enough to look brand new, just enough to be legible. He noticed it and didn't stop. He drove north on Highway 35 toward San Antonio, with the windows down and the cold December air coming in and the radio off, and the land on both sides of the highway went on, the way it does in that part of Texas. Vast and quiet and indifferent to everything except the weather and the seasons and the slow work of staying alive, which is not so different from what people do really, when you strip away the ceremony of it. He thought about the song he had written on a Thursday night at his kitchen table, and about the face of the 1,100 people in the South pasture when he played it, and about Dale Hoffman's hands flat on the table, and about Cassie Hoffman's mother's silver earrings in the November light, and about a community that had been slowly losing its reasons to stay together, and had found one. He didn't think of any of it as something he had done. He thought of it as something that had happened, the way good things happen sometimes, not because anyone engineered them, but because someone showed up in the right place at the right moment with the right attention and paid it. The highway ran north. The sky was the same cobalt blue it had been the day he drove down, deep and electric and all the way through. He put his hand out the window and felt the cold air moving over his palm. He drove. 6 months later, Craig Ellison received a journalism award from the Texas Press Association for his coverage of the Frio County agricultural crisis and the community response. In his acceptance remarks, he said that the most important thing he had ever learned as a journalist was the difference between a story about a person and a story about what a person makes possible. The best stories, he said, are never really about the person everyone came to see. They're about the people who were already there. Cassie Hoffman took the position at the Austin School. She drives back to Driscoll Creek most weekends. The coffee has improved. The Hoffman property is, as of this writing, fully operational. Dale Hoffman is, by all accounts, fine.